For generations, men living in the ridges and valleys of Appalachia believed the earth beneath them had finished moving. The truth is that the region hides one of the most active earthquake belts in the eastern half of the country. Paleoseismic evidence shows this deep crust previously ruptured with magnitude 6 or larger events. That same buried fault system runs directly under modern highways, dams, and the Watts Bar nuclear plant. Drive through Knoxville or Chattanooga and the roads feel solid. Neighborhoods sit on old hills, and the Tennessee River winds through familiar bends. The landscape looks like it has been sitting there forever. The short written history of the region only goes back about 150 years. That human timeline records mostly small to moderate shakes that rattle dishes and fade away. The written catalog forms a mental trap. People naturally look at the biggest recent quake they have seen and treat it like the absolute ceiling. On a human clock, a century feels long, but on a geologic clock, it is nothing more than a blink. The short record simply cannot tell the full story of a fault system that waits many centuries between major ruptures. The Earth keeps a completely different record. The East Tennessee Seismic Zone stretches 217 miles from northeastern Alabama through Tennessee and into southeastern Kentucky. It is not a single visible crack. It is a broad belt of basement faults buried roughly 3 to 16 miles down. Those ancient breaks formed hundreds of millions of years ago when the Appalachian Mountains were pushed upward. Those deep structures stayed physical zones of weakness. Present-day regional stress fields continue acting on those old faults. The pressure causes small slips, releasing energy that travels upward as a steady background of microquakes. Some researchers suggest deep groundwater changes might even add enough pressure to help trigger small events. The zone does not need a giant historical disaster to matter. The danger sits in the severe mismatch between what the surface shows and what the geology says the crust can do. United States Geological Survey hazard models combine modern quake patterns with paleoseismic evidence. They look at fault lengths and structural geometry. That data produces an upper bound hazard estimate near magnitude 7.5 for the zone. The ground structure leaves physical room for a massive event over long time scales. Researchers do not guess at those hazard numbers. They dig into river valley sediments near places like Dandridge to find the physical proof. The soft dirt there acts like an archive. Geologists mapped thrust faults and fissures showing about 1 meter of displacement. One solid block of earth violently shoved over another. They also documented sand blows and dikes caused by liquefaction. Liquefaction occurs when violent motion forces wet ground to act like a liquid. The intense pressure builds below, causing sand and water to blast upward through the soil. Those venting features only form under serious seismic force. The scars around the French Broad River and Douglas Lake show that strong earthquakes hit this region repeatedly during the late Quaternary period. That span covers the last 25,000 years. That timeline is extremely recent in geologic terms. Rare does not mean impossible. It just means the massive event does not line up neatly with the short written history. The prehistoric ruptures broke ground that was mostly empty wilderness. Today, the modern map of interstates, utility networks, and dense cities sits over that exact same belt. A major earthquake in this specific corridor would strike a highly wired, built-up landscape. Planners working on critical infrastructure take that hidden system seriously. The structural design of the Watts Bar nuclear plant proves it. The facility sits near Spring City, directly inside the folded rock of the southern Appalachian structural province. Mid-century engineers picked the spot, because the Tennessee River offered massive cooling water and easy transmission access into the regional grid. They knew the facility was going inside an active seismic zone. They did not dodge the geology. They tried to outbuild it with heavy engineering. The facility was designed around the safe shutdown earthquake. That benchmark represents the strongest postulated ground motion the plant must survive while safely cooling down and maintaining containment. Early guidelines tied that benchmark roughly to modified Mercalli intensity 08 at the site. Intensity 8 means severe physical motion capable of shifting heavy furniture, cracking masonry walls, and throwing down tall chimneys. Regulators required conservative margins thick enough to handle a magnitude 7 class event nearby. The plant near Spring City basically carries two different clocks at once. One is the mid-century project clock, driven by river cooling, transmission access, and regional power demand. The other is the geologic clock, defined by folded rock, long quiet periods, and deep stress building overspan much longer than memory. Watt's bar physically sits exactly where those two distinct clocks overlap. That confident engineering faced a severe real-world test on December 12, 2018. A magnitude 4.4 earthquake struck just 2 miles east of the Watts bar plant. It was the largest recorded earthquake in Tennessee in about 45 years. The shallow shock was felt strongly across the region and as far south as Atlanta. The massive facility suffered no damage, and reactor operations continued normally. However, the story did not end when the shaking stopped. Strong motion instruments at the site recorded the exact kinetic forces. Follow-up analysis revealed the plant's design basis was exceeded in certain frequency bands. The data proved the local fault system could deliver a sharp, shallow hit much closer than older expectations originally captured. That reality forced experts to reevaluate the seismic hazard models for the site. Crews updated the probabilistic seismic hazard assessment and the seismic probabilistic risk assessment. They tightened safety margins and rigorously reviewed whether critical shutdown systems would hold if a larger event strikes from the same short distance. The review focused entirely on future readiness. Size is only one factor when measuring destruction. Depth and precise location dictate the actual cost. Sparta, North Carolina, learned that hard lesson in 2020. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake hit the small courthouse town. That number sounds moderate on paper, but the rupture happened extremely close to the surface. Shallow mechanics hit the ground with massive concentrated punch. The peak ground acceleration near the surface reached 0.2 to 0.3 g. The force tore a visible fault scarp roughly 1.5 miles long right through the landscape. The ground physically shifted, snapping buried utility lines and breaking paved roads. That kind of surface break is incredibly rare for an eastern quake under magnitude 6. The town center took a direct hit from the kinetic energy. Sparta was packed full of old brick storefronts and unreinforced masonry homes. Brick walls handle deep winters well, but they cannot flex when the earth violently jerks back and forth. The motion cracked heavy masonry, shifted foundational supports, and threw down chimneys. Over 530 homes and businesses suffered at least moderate damage. The state eventually allocated $24 million in dedicated recovery funds. In Sparta, the heavy bill was largely driven by layered infrastructure failure. Once the fault scarp broke the surface, the damage stacked rapidly. First, the older homes took the hit, then the businesses, then the paved roads physically separated, then the buried water and sewer pipes snapped, then came the electrical repairs, mandatory structural inspections, and massive stabilization work. A foundation that settles slowly over decades can be patched easily, but a foundation forcefully shifted by direct fault movement requires a completely different scale of repair. The damage spread fast because the vulnerability was tightly concentrated in the core. If the exact same quake hit a rural valley, the damage would have scattered harmlessly. Striking directly under stiff buildings turned a mid-size event into a massive financial burden. Sparta proved that Appalachian towns do not need a giant magnitude to face heavy destruction. Earthquakes in the eastern half of the country also behave differently across long distances. In 2011, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake started deep in Virginia. The aggressive shaking was felt from Georgia all the way up to Canada. A quake of that size in California would rattle a much tighter, localized footprint. When the Virginia earthquake struck, the transmission was incredibly efficient. A person sitting inside an office hundreds of miles away from the epicenter could feel their desk shake and watch a hanging light swing. The distance felt entirely wrong to anyone accustomed to typical Western earthquakes. California mountains look rougher and more dramatic, leading people to incorrectly assume they carry earthquake force farther. But surface shape is absolutely not the main issue. The massive physical reach of the Virginia event comes down to the extreme age of the deep rock. The crust east of the Rocky Mountains is hundreds of millions of years older than the crust out west. It had immense time to slowly cool, densify, and lock up into a continuous mass. The western continental edge remains hot, young, and heavily fractured by active faulting. When seismic waves hit broken western rock, the energy scatters and burns off quickly over a short distance. Eastern rock acts like a highly efficient transmission system. The older crust lacks fresh, open fractures, so it passes high-frequency shaking along with minimal attenuation. The dense, unbroken eastern rock below is what actually hands the motion along. The kinetic waves travel huge distances before losing their structural strength. The initial size of the rupture does not change, but the intact rock carries the kinetic energy directly into far-off towns and cities. That transmission efficiency makes the East Tennessee seismic zone a regional threat rather than an isolated local one. A magnitude 6 event under Dandridge or Sweetwater would spread destructive force rapidly across multiple state lines. The kinetic energy would slam into bridges, water treatment plants, steel pipelines, and electrical substations far from the epicenter. The unbroken older crust guarantees a remarkably wide strike zone. Despite running beneath critical dams and power plants, this deep system remains one of the least studied major seismic zones in the East. The active faults sit far underground and rarely leave clean surface lines for scientists to map visually. Researchers must rely on distinct wave patterns, deep seismic imaging, and dense temporary listening arrays to find the moving structures. The complex work requires immense funding and patient long-term observation. Better modern instruments continually expose a much busier underground environment. The buried crust was always moving. The region simply lacked the sensitive equipment to hear the deep shifting clearly. Every new data set reveals tighter microquake clusters and clarifies the specific depths of the ongoing slips. The science constantly updates, but it only reinforces the serious physical threat hidden inside the ancient rock. Fiddles and banjos still play together today, blending European melodies with rhythms that trace to African musical traditions. Wild ramps still grow in shaded forests every spring. Sorghum syrup still pours over biscuits in kitchens across the region right now. The cultural roots run deep, but the physical roots of the mountains hide a violent history. The people living above this active belt fundamentally trust the familiar shape of the ridges. The valleys look deeply settled, and the river bends provide reliable water for the heavy industry. Yet the quiet surface completely masks the intense physical pressure building miles below. Small tectonic slips continue releasing kinetic energy along the basement faults every single week. The internal tension never actually leaves the system. This entire structural inheritance directly belongs to the communities stretching from Alabama all the way up into Kentucky. The exact same buried faults sit firmly beneath the daily commercial traffic on Interstate 40. The deep bedrock permanently holds the physical memory of massive ancient ruptures, the specific geological conditions that allowed those prehistoric events remain entirely intact. The ground carries a delayed mechanical motion that will eventually release. A heavy nuclear facility continually monitors the kinetic forces right now. The soft river valleys still contain the physical scars of massive ancient displacements. The older crust waits quietly to carry the next major shockwave across a massive stretch of the country. The East Tennessee seismic zone has always been there, constantly moving in the dark. The familiar ground beneath the Appalachian Mountains continues shifting today,